Hello, I'm Sheila WEBBER and I'm a senior lecturer at the Information School at the University of Sheffield in the UK.
Hi, I'm Chris Thorpe. I am a subject librarian for health sciences in library services at City University of London, also in the UK.
And we're going to be talking about fake news. Has it changed UK academic librarians' ideas about teaching information literacy? So first of all, the presentation overview. Chris is going to start by giving background and context of the research that he did, and then talk about the results, the key findings, and some key themes. After that, Chris and I are going to talk about some ideas and some questions that we've been discussing between us this year, and we're going to lead on from that to get some really good discussion going during the conference. So now I'll hand over to Chris.
Thanks, Sheila. I was studying for an MA in Library and Information Services Management at the University of Sheffield in the iSchool, and I was interested in looking at fake news. I have a background in journalism and media studies. I did my undergraduate degree at Birkbeck, and I was interested in the topic of fake news and particularly the discourse around the role of library and information professionals in addressing the topic. At the time of carrying out my dissertation, I was just beginning a role as subject librarian here at City and undertaking teaching responsibilities. So I thought this was a really good opportunity to carry out some theoretical research that had direct implications for my practice. A discourse had kind of emerged that was looking at libraries and librarianship as having a crucial role in leading the examination and appraisal of the topic of fake news. It was predominantly happening in the US, and it was situating information professionals as the moral and ethical custodians who are in charge of safeguarding our information futures. And I found that librarian and librarianship was being depicted as best positioned to lead the fight against what was seen as a growing threat of fake news based on professional reputation of librarians, their standing within local communities, and their experience of teaching information literacy. I felt that there was a lot of calls for librarians to take action, but that they were coming from individuals with the opportunity to do so, to be able to express their opinions widely. And there was a question as to what extent librarians themselves working on the front line in universities, colleges, other workplaces, were actually engaged with or accepting of this premise. My key research question was, what impact do UK HE librarians believe the fake news discourse is having on their conceptions of information literacy and resultant pedagogic practice? I carried out 7 semi-structured interviews with staff members at City University of London. And then that was followed by a critical thematic analysis of the resulting data. I wanted to ascertain the subjective real-world experience of practitioners and examine it within the context of the prevailing literature. I think it's important to acknowledge my position as a researcher in research. So it was carried out at a time when I was balancing full-time work. I had caring responsibilities, addressing my own mental health needs. And so to a certain extent, I adopted a pragmatic approach to my research. So that was things like proximity to my subjects, the availability, time and access constraints. So that inevitably results in some potential limits in terms of the validity and wider applicability of my results. My preference would have been to have had a mixed methods approach, which had a wider catchment. I wanted to ideally use focus groups, followed by some semi-structured interviews, perhaps with some questionnaires, and then I've been able to carry it out, hopefully better facilitated the triangulation between the results in terms of the analysis. However, the colleagues that I interviewed support a variety of students across a range of disciplines. There are a mixture of embedded voluntary teaching sessions, different opportunities to engage with students. And I felt that given the range of ages, genders, nationalities, experiences within the team, staff members at all different grades, that this catchment of individuals would lead to an interesting and still relevant set of results. And obviously I tried to kind of carry out my research to the highest level possible in terms of academic rigor and reflexivity, so that I could maintain my credibility as a researcher. So my participants recognised that they had a role to play in addressing fake news within a wider societal context, but they overwhelmingly rejected the notion that librarians were both best placed and primarily responsible for tackling it. The notion of librarians' neutrality was questioned, as was the framing of staff as a homogenous group of professionals who could be rallied or marshalled into action, as opposed to a range of diverse individuals across the public and private sectors with different levels of skills, experience, and constraints which would impact their interventions. A perception emerged that issues such as a lack of embedded teaching, limited student contact time, and balancing of teaching with existing workloads are not really accounted for within the discourse. And the contentiousness of information literacy, both in terms of its terminology and conceptual formation, was a key point to emerge from the interviews. I think this has implications, or potentially has implications, for those advocating its applicability in addressing fake news. One theme that was identified from the interviews was a sense of critical reticence. So a perceived reluctance to be critical in discussions, particularly around the topic of information literacy. So what did this look like? What I found, there were lots of comments which were frequently prefixed or suffixed with despairing expressions, self-deprecating remarks, often the use of humour, for example, nervous laughter, to kind of deflect away moments of silence or hesitancy, or particularly discussions around aspects of the topic or issues which were kind of felt maybe controversial in some way. And I think coupled with evidence of professional frustration and concerns over professional recognition outside the profession, it's perhaps suggestive of a sector which exists with its own filter bubble. It's continually in the process of discussing issues internally, whilst failing to reflect the multitude of diverse and contradictory voices which actually exist. However, a detailed exploration of this idea of critical reticence was kind of beyond the scope of my research in itself. And there were lots of different factors which might have influenced how this was borne out: subjectivity, proximity, to me as the interviewer, things like that. So the way I'd characterise critical reticence is that it was noteworthy from the interviews, but also problematic in this context. The library services staff that I interviewed are and were highly committed to their role in supporting students, very considered in their approach to teaching, and very much motivated to have a positive impact on the lives of users beyond their studies. So throughout their studies, beyond into kind of, their post-academic life, professional lives. The extent to which the fake news discourse is having an impact on conceptions of information literacy and pedagogy in relation to experience, however, is questionable. Although fake news emboldened some interviewers' approach to practice and provided a new tool to engage users with, kind of a hook, if you like, there was an overwhelming rejection of the premise that librarians are and should be best positioned to tackle the problem of fake news.
So, Chris and I have been discussing this research, which took place pre-COVID, and we've identified a number of what we think are interesting points for discussion, and we're really hoping that during the conference itself, we'll be able to take time to discuss this with participants in our session. And so we're going to present these questions or comments one by one and indicate what kind of thing we mean by it. Over to you, Chris, for this first one.
Yes, so I think one of the themes which came out of the research was this idea of critical reticence. And we were wondering, is it still with us? And I think a quick look at literature on the kind of topic, particularly around fake news and librarianship, would suggest that I think it still is. On the one hand, you can find articles within the last year or two highlighting the potential role for librarians, information professionals, and teaching information literacy to combat disinformation, information around COVID and vaccine hesitancy, these kind of issues, and sort of following on from the same sort of discourse that I encountered at the beginning of the research. And at the same time, you'll also find articles which are questioning why librarians aren't best positioned to tackle this and why they're not best positioned to tackle fake news, and kind of really reflecting on the role of information literacy. So I think it is still relevant, and I think one of the key things I was interested in was a perceived disconnection between the way in which librarians and information literacy on the one hand are being discussed and talked about in some areas, and how practitioners on a day-to-day basis feel about those kind of discussions and the theory behind it.
Yes, and it's something I feel quite strongly about because although I know that it can be challenging if you're in a situation where people don't recognise the term information literacy, I feel that it's important to label information literacy with the same term when people come across it in different contexts. Otherwise, they'll never learn what it is. So, for example, if you're a university librarian teaching education students, it would be really useful to school librarians if you told them that this set of skills and understanding was information literacy, so that when the school librarian approached the teacher in the school, they might actually recognise that term. And also other professions, including things like marketing, I'm not just thinking hardcore professions, but tend to be quite assertive in saying this is what this is called. And so I think that reticence is a really interesting phenomenon in librarianship. And the next question is this one of, are librarians the go-to people for COVID information and advice on combating misinformation? And an example here is the World Health Organization, who's identified the problem of infodemics, epidemics of misinformation, and has got an international action line to do with this. It's held a couple of international conferences about infodemics and invited academics from all kinds of disciplines, historians, sociologists, and so forth. But they've left out of it information scientists and librarians. So it seems like in some circles, not only are they not the go-to people, but they're getting overlooked when thinking about misinformation. I'm partly, I would say, because some people are shouting louder about their expertise in this area.
And I think there is a variation between experiences of librarians in different sectors. I was reading some reports from clinical librarians and talking about the important role they've played in terms of information seeking and putting together documentation on COVID, latest treatments, etc. From my experience working in academic libraries, we put together some resources for our students like most libraries did. But I don't think I've received a single inquiry from a student or staff, particularly on COVID, coronavirus, seeking out information. Some students talked about it in terms of dissertations and different aspects of topics they were looking at, but not specifically, can I recall anyone coming to me and asking for help navigating the infodemic, as it were.
That's again connected to this question of librarians see a significant role, but maybe playing catch up if some of these large national and international organisations aren't immediately calling on the librarians and information scientists. So do you think that connects with the points that you were just making, Chris?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's librarians sometimes perhaps catching up with ourselves in a lot of cases. I know that there's been things like the new work being done by CILIP, an information literacy group looking at developing a role in terms of supporting media literacy and working towards responding to the government looking at media and digital literacy and things like that. And so on the one hand, I think there's librarians maybe catching up with other aspects of our profession, which are also developing those strands. And then on a broader note as well, a lot of those kind of plans that are put in place by governments and by agencies and that don't feature librarians or staff, researchers, academics within this kind of area from the beginning. And often we feel like we're having to kind of wave a flag or sort of announce that we're still here and kind of latch on and find ways to become involved rather than being involved from the start.
And so where could librarians have contributed in disseminating effective information, for example, about the pandemic and countering the fake news? Do you think we could have been doing more about that?
Well, I certainly think if I looked at or if I brought up my Twitter timeline from a lot of the COVID briefings that took place, I know lots of people I know who work within the sector or the profession had lots of advice for the people standing at podiums asking to see the next slide and presenting data. I think they certainly felt like if they'd have asked a librarian or anybody that worked in the information professions, they could have provided some good advice on what graphs to show and how to illustrate some of the trends and lines that took place. So I think definitely there was a role there for information professionals to have been involved, and particularly with communicating to the general public COVID-related information.
So we're going to finish by referring to two different experts. And first of all, I'll hand over to Chris to talk about this reference to Barbara Pfister.
Yeah, so I thought there were lots of really interesting sessions and talks at Festival this year, the information conference put together by the people behind LILA, Information Literacy Conference. One of the talks was from Barbara Pfister. Barbara talked about this idea. It was a talk on the role of fake news and QAnon in America. One of the points made was that perhaps we've spent a great deal of time focusing on teaching skepticism and people to be wary about information and to question everything, which obviously there's some really good aspects to that. But perhaps what we've neglected to do is focus on educating people on how to trust sources and engender a sense of trustworthiness with the information they find as well, to encourage that development. And I think there is a tension there. If you're telling people to be critical and really think through their information, you can't be surprised if a lot of them then seem to be very critical and reluctant to trust certain sources. So I think it sparked a really interesting sort of discussion and a viewpoint. I think it's very much relevant to this topic.
And mine is also a takeaway from a conference, and similarly is about, I think, emphasising the positive. So Neil Pakenham-Walsh is the leader of an initiative to do with quality health information. It's a worldwide initiative. And he made a point at the IFLA World Library and Information Congress that rather than treating misinformation as the disease or the problem, we should be looking at it as the symptom of a problem, and the actual problem and the actual disease, to use that kind of metaphor, is the lack of robust information infrastructure. So that what should be happening is focusing on how can we make the infrastructure, and he was particularly talking about health information, how can you make that quality health information infrastructure better internationally in different countries around the world where it's very variable, and to focus on that positive thing where obviously library and information professionals have a role, rather than seeing it as a kind of deficit and you've got to keep kind of, again, playing catch up to give people the skills so they can fight the misinformation. If there was better information to start with, then that would solve some of the symptoms. You wouldn't get so many of the misinformation symptoms in the first place. To me, it was a really good point. And going back to the media literacy strategy in the UK that Chris just mentioned, that very much takes a deficit approach to people, that people are lacking the skills in fighting misinformation and being safe online. So you've kind of got to play catch up and give them the skills and defend them against the ills and the bad people who are trying to plague them, rather than looking positively at developing an infrastructure that makes it easier to be, I suppose, well with information. So thank you for watching this video, and we're really looking forward to discussing the questions and the issues that we've been raising, particularly in the last slide, at the session at the Information Literacy Conference. And so I'll say goodbye, and Chris.
Goodbye, and chat to you soon.